One nation under blackmail, the sordid union between intelligence and organized crime that gave rise to Jeffrey Epstein, Volume 1 and 2 by Whitney Webb. Published in 2022 by Whitney Webb. Publishers forward. Prospero. But you, my brace of lords, were I so minded, I here could pluck his highness's frown upon you, and justify you traitors at this time. I will tell no lies. Sebastian, the devil speaks in him. William Shakespeare, The Tempest, Act 5, Scene 1. I want something embarrassing, something sexual. Little boys, midgets, that sort of thing. Cows, I don't give a goddamn. Sam Elliott as Kermit Newman, the contender. Where's my Roy Cohn? Donald Trump, New York Times, January 4th, 2018. Why do folks lie, cheat, and steal? Is it simply the survival of the fittest? What about our rule of law and the hoary moral codes left to us? Are they worth the paper they are printed on? Will we ever learn? Whitney Webb takes us on a hidden history excursion beyond the realm of the gatekeepers, delving into a deep netherworld where disgraceful actions seemingly trump noble principles. One nation under blackmail, the sordid union between intelligence and crime that gave rise to Jeffrey Epstein, is a tour de force, a deep expose into how the world actually works. I will never forget my introduction to this underworld, a talk with my spooky father and his professor friend from Vanderbilt. It was a reality beyond my ken, way further than my teenage experience. So I simply went on with growing up, but looking in the dark corners. My education was through reading, magazine articles, and books. So many books. There was much going on in the late 1960s and 70s. My father and his friend had talked about an activity I call CIA drugs, and about political forces using psychological warfare to move agendas. It soon became apparent that within this milieu there were many players, intelligence agencies and their operatives, criminal gangs, secret societies, bagmen, money launderers, financial institutions, and governments. As my studies into intelligence matters and protocols progressed, I became aware of honey traps and the use of blackmail to compromise individuals and stilt honest political discourse. It floored me that there were, it appeared, federal agents running interference to some of the operations. Where was the country and the values I had been taught? How did we get here? It's far more constructive to work for the church than to work for the Central Intelligence Agency. When you work for the CIA, the ends justify the means. My father was quoted in a local paper a few years before his passing. Immoral methods skew our futures and lead to imbalance, leaving us ruled by rich men who are not quite respectable. British historian Eric Hobsbawm opined, he, Roy Cohn, made his legal and political career in a milieu where money and power override rules and law. Indeed, where the ability to get and get away with what lesser citizens cannot is what proves membership of an elite. A corrupt elite debasing our future, trying to bully us into their depravity. With this book and others, we can become educated and empowered to right our ship of state. Whitney has done her homework, and A Nation Under Blackmail shows with great alacrity the past actions, present situations, and future problems that we face and must deal with in order to fulfill our founders' aspirations, foster current needs, and foresee our children's future. A blackmailer believes that they are in control, but secrets can cut many ways, and ultimately, we are in the driver's seat. What will we do? Onwards to the utmost of futures. Peace. R.A. Chris Milligan, publisher, Trine Day. August 18th, 2022. Contents. Introduction. 1. The Underworld. 2. Booze and Blackmail. 3. Organized crime in the State of Israel. 4. Roy Cohn's Favor Bank. 5. Shades of Grey. 6. A private CIA. 7. A killer enterprise. 8. Clinton Contra. 9. High-tech treason. 10. Government by blackmail. The dark secrets of the Reagan era. Documents Index. Introduction. Volume 1. The July 2019 arrest of Jeffrey Epstein and his subsequent death that August brought national as well as international attention to a sex ring where certain members of the power elite sexually abused and exploited female minors and young women. Epstein's death, officially ruled a suicide, has been treated skeptically by many for a variety of reasons. Regardless of the real circumstances of his death, it has led to scores of Americans embracing the view that his death was both intentional and necessary to protect his powerful co-conspirators and the full extent of his covert and illegal activities. Even if one chooses not to entertain such disconcerting possibilities, it is quite apparent that most of those who aided or enabled Epstein will never see the inside of a prison cell. Though Ghislaine Maxwell is now serving a 20-year sentence, others known to have been intimately involved in his illegal activities continue to enjoy protection from the so-called sweetheart deal or plea deal that followed Epstein's first run-in with the law for his sex trafficking activities in the mid-2000s. In addition, Ghislaine Maxwell's recent trial saw information involving third parties redacted, leading many to believe that the public will never know the names of the Johns or clients who benefited from the sex trafficking activities of Epstein and Maxwell, and who were potentially blackmailed by them. Yet, for both Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, there is much more to the story. This became apparent when it emerged that Alex Acosta, then serving as Secretary of Labor in the Trump administration, had disclosed to the Trump transition team that he had previously signed off on Epstein's sweetheart deal because Epstein had belonged to intelligence. Acosta, then serving as U.S. Attorney for Southern Florida, had also been told by unspecified figures at the time that he needed to give Epstein a lenient sentence because of his links to intelligence. When Acosta was later asked if Epstein was indeed an intelligence asset in 2019, Acosta chose to neither confirm or deny the claim. Other hints of a connection between Epstein and intelligence subsequently emerged, with reporting from a variety of sources that Epstein was affiliated with the CIA, Israeli intelligence, or both. Despite the implications and significance of these connections to intelligence, most of mainstream media declined to dig deeper into these claims, instead largely focusing on the salacious aspects of the Epstein case. The narrative soon became that Epstein was an anomaly, the sole mastermind of an industrial sex trafficking enterprise, and a talented con artist. Even his closest associates and benefactors, like retail billionaire Leslie Wexner, have been taken at their word that they knew nothing of Epstein's crimes, even when there is considerable evidence to the contrary. Indeed, it was later stated by Cindy McCain, wife of former Senator John McCain, that we all knew what he, Epstein, was doing at an event in January 2020, where she also claimed that authorities were afraid to properly apprehend him. If he was such an anomaly and a standalone con artist, how was he single-handedly able to intimidate the law enforcement apparatus of an entire nation for decades? The claim that Epstein did not have powerful backers and benefactors stands on incredibly shaky ground. Oddly enough, mainstream reporting on Epstein was once relatively open about his alleged intelligence ties, with British media reporting as early as 1992 and throughout the early 2000s that Epstein had ties to both US and Israeli intelligence. In addition, also in the early 1990s, Epstein's name was mysteriously dropped from a major investigation into one of the largest Ponzi schemes in history, even though he was labeled the mastermind of that swindle in grand jury testimony. Around the same time, subsequently released White House visitor logs show that Epstein visited the Clinton White House 17 times, accompanied on most of these visits by a different, attractive young woman. Reporting on those visitor logs was largely done by a single media outlet, Britain's The Daily Mail, with hardly any American mainstream media outlets bothering to investigate these revelations about Epstein and a former U.S. president. Why was Epstein so heavily protected from justice for decades, in connection to both his sex trafficking crimes and his financial crimes? Why have the once commonly reported intelligence connections of Jeffrey Epstein now been relegated to conspiracy theory, despite evidence to the contrary? If powerful senators knew what Epstein was doing to young women and girls, who else knew? And why wasn't something done? This 2-volume book endeavors to show why Jeffrey Epstein was able to engage in a series of mind-boggling crimes for decades without incident. Far from being an anomaly, Epstein was one of several men who, over the past century, have engaged in sexual blackmail activities designed to obtain damaging information, i.e., intelligence, on powerful individuals, with the goal of controlling their activities and securing their compliance. Most of these individuals, including Epstein himself, have their roots in the covert world where organized crime and intelligence have intermingled and often cooperated for the better part of the last 90 years, if not longer. Perhaps most shockingly, these men are all interconnected to various degrees. Following the formal establishment of the organized crime intelligence in World War II through what is today remembered as Operation Underworld, the relationship between these two entities has since become so intertwined and so symbiotic that today it is nearly impossible to know where one ends and the other begins. As this book will show, many of the biggest scandals and events of the last century have not only been tied to these networks, but many of them also have counted with the involvement of sex traffickers and blackmailers, Epstein among them. Publicly, these men have been powerful lawyers, businessmen, and lobbyists. Their more clandestine and shadowy activities, though a matter of record, are often known only to those who are well read on certain historical events or in the field of deep politics. In order to understand Jeffrey Epstein and his activities in their full context, one must understand his powerful contacts and the structures that protected him. Those structures and those networks did not begin with Jeffrey Epstein, and they also did not die with him. In revealing his broader milieu and that of his past associates and clients, one is left not only with a damning indictment of Jeffrey Epstein, but a damning indictment of American institutions, particularly those involved in national security matters and law enforcement. We cannot properly address the crimes of Jeffrey Epstein, nor prevent them being committed by others in the future, unless we grapple with the covert power structures that have long wielded blackmail, bribes, and assassinations as their weapons of choice to corrupt and control public institutions while manipulating and looting the public. Jeffrey Epstein was not an anomaly, and his activities represent just the tip of the veritable iceberg. Whitney Webb, August 14th, 2022. Who are these people? They are the group that is popularly called the Enterprise. They are in and outside the CIA. They are mostly right-wing Republicans, but you will find a mix of Democrats, mercenaries, ex officio mafia, and opportunists within the group. They are CEOs, they are bankers, they are presidents. They own airlines, they own national television networks. They own 6 of the 7 video documentary companies of Washington, D.C., and they do not give a damn about the law or the Constitution or the Congress or the oversight committees, except as something to be subverted and manipulated and lied to. They abhor sunlight and love darkness. They deal in innuendo and character assassination, and planted stories, the incomplete thought and sentence. They burn and shred files if caught. They commit perjury, and when caught, they have guaranteed sinecures with large U.S. corporations. If you let them, they will take over not only the CIA, but the entire government and the world, cutting off dissent, free speech, a free media, and they will cut a deal with anyone, from the mafia to Saddam Hussein, if it means more power and money. They stole $600 billion from the SNLs and then diverted our attention to the Iraqis. They are ripping off America at a rate never before seen in history. They flooded our country with drugs from Central America during the 1980s, cut deals with Haro in Mexico, Noriega in Panama, and the Medellin and Cali cartels, and Castro, and recently the Red Mafia in the KGB. They ruin their detractors, and they fear the truth. If they can, they will blackmail you. Sex, drugs, deals, whatever it takes. Former CIA officer and Iran-Contra whistleblower Bruce Hemings, circa 1990. Chapter 1. The Underworld. Of Spies and Crooks. At 2:30 in the afternoon on February 9th, 1942, a fire broke out on board the Normandy, a ship that was then in the process of being converted into a troop transporter in New York City's harbor. As the flames roared, winter winds fanned the flames, spiraling the fire up, and then down onto the ship's top decks. Within hours, the Normandy began to lean to her port side, weighed down by the water that was being dumped onto the boat by fire crews. Soon, the ship capsized and an expensive, unprecedented salvage operation was mounted. Despite these efforts, repairing the ship was soon found to be too complicated and too costly, and the Normandy was scrapped in 1946. Investigations into the destruction of the Normandy quickly revealed that the cause of the disaster had been incompetence and carelessness. Yet, nevertheless, rumors grew that it had been the work of German saboteurs who were intent on disrupting America's early war efforts. Proponents of these theories argued that the alleged saboteurs sought to break down the country's logistical capabilities, through attacks in ports and harbors, as well as factories and other strategic industrial locations. William B. Herlands, the then New York Commissioner of Investigation, summed up the spirit of the times when he said, "We are faced with a grave national emergency. A blackout was imposed over the waterfront area within the 3rd Naval District, which included New York and New Jersey. Many of our ships were being sunk by enemy submarines off the Atlantic coast, and the outcome of the war hung in the balance." Management and regulation of these critical harbors and coastlines was the responsibility of the Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI. An ONI inquiry was opened in May 1942 into potential saboteurs and Nazi agents operating in the ports and the possibility of U-boat movements off the East Coast. The man tasked with overseeing the inquiry was C. Radcliffe Haffenden. Several of the agents assigned to work under Haffenden had previously worked with Thomas E. Dewey, the U.S. State Attorney who later served as governor of New York. Dewey was best known for his prosecution of organized crime, and through these contacts, Haffenden learned of the role played by gangsters and other criminal elements on the New York City waterfront. Dewey's chief of staff, attorney Frank Hogan, suggested to Haffenden and the ONI that they speak with a man named Joseph Joe Sox Lanza. Lanza was officially a business agent for the United Seafood Workers Union. He was also a mobster in his own right and was known as the racket's boss of the Fulton Fish Market in downtown New York City. Yet, compared to the stature of other criminal figures in the city, Lanza was a small fry, and he knew it. As a result, he ended up telling the ONI that they would have better luck higher up the food chain. He suggested either Meyer Lansky, who controlled the Longshoremen's Union, or Frank Costello, a gambling figure with numerous interests throughout the waterfront. But to get to them, Lanza told Haffenden he would need to first speak to Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano at the time was locked away in prison, having been put there by Thomas Dewey. A delicate series of negotiations were subsequently launched in what is now known as Operation Underworld. This operation, which the government was forced to reluctantly acknowledge after decades of public denials, involved the recruitment of high-level organized crime figures for work with American intelligence services, justified by wartime necessity. Not long after Operation Underworld had been given the go-ahead, Luciano agreed to the ONI's requests, and his prison cell soon became a hub for meetings between him and his criminal associates, meetings in which they would coordinate counterintelligence activities with the Navy. Despite Operation Underworld's initial and relatively narrow objectives, the scope of the operation organically expanded. Before long, Luciano and his colleagues, Meyer Lansky, chief among them, were helping the ONI cultivate intelligence for the Allied invasion of Sicily. Lower-ranking mob figures and immigrants were frequently brought to Haffenden's offices for questioning. Names and contact information for friendly Sicilians, many of whom were mafia figures, were provided to ONI agents for use in the military campaign. While the resulting collaborations between the mafia and the military on the beaches and in the villages of Sicily have slipped into legend, the legacy of Operation Underworld has endured and undeniably forever altered the United States of America and beyond. Indeed, Operation Underworld was the beginning of the creation of a new underworld entirely, one built on the cooperation, if not outright symbiosis, between organized crime and American intelligence. Shadowy alliances. Lucky Luciano was born in Sicily in 1897 and arrived on American shores in 1906. At a young age, he formed his own gang, which offered protection to Jewish immigrants from Italian and Irish organized crime elements in exchange for small fees. This protection, unsurprisingly, was tantamount to extortion, and the money he accrued allowed him to begin expanding into other rackets, including, notably, prostitution. Early on, he met and formed an alliance with another young gangster named Frank Costello, an immigrant from Calabria, Italy. Together, the two consolidated their power by taking control of the numerous environs now considered typical of organized crime: prostitution, narcotics, and even organized labor in New York City's docks. As their business expanded, so too did their revenue. Soon, Luciano and his cohorts were being propelled to the heights of power in New York City. Thomas Dewey once commented that Luciano's business was far-flung and brought in a colossal revenue. This was estimated to be far in excess of $12 million a year. Key to Luciano and Costello's operation was the fact that it had overcome the traditional bifurcation of organized crime into ethnic enclaves. For the first time in Luciano's growing criminal empire, Italian, Jewish, and Irish criminal networks intermingled and cooperated with one another. However, this early cooperation lacked the cohesion and integration that the networks born out of Luciano's and Costello's enterprise would develop in the years to come. Joining Luciano and Costello in their criminal enterprise was Meyer Lansky and his close friend, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Lansky was well connected in Jewish mob circles, and he, along with Siegel, had amassed significant wealth during the Prohibition era. Lansky, whose long shadow is cast across the entire history of organized crime in the 20th century, was something of a visionary. Various accounts paint him as the intellectual architect behind the multi-ethnic organized crime model that Luciano successfully pursued. Lansky was also instrumental in bringing mob groups into the world of gambling, helping set up casinos in the Caribbean that would be utilized to wash the money generated by their various vices and rackets. Perhaps most important of all was that Lansky had also developed... Let's fix that part. Okay. Made it pretty good. Trying to record a good version of this as I go. Let's do Shift D here. Perhaps most important of all. Perhaps most important of all was that Lansky had also helped develop the use of a complex banking network, which he adopted in an effort to avoid the fate of Al Capone. After all, Capone had not been taken down not for murder or extortion, but for tax evasion. This Luciano, Costello, Lansky, Siegel alliance was the basis of what subsequently became known as the National Crime Syndicate. Far from the well-organized image of the mafia often promoted by the media, the National Crime Syndicate operated loosely at best, and, according to some commentators, did not actually exist in any meaningful way. Such arguments might be going a step too far, although they are worth considering. The National Crime Syndicate might be best understood as a social network, a sprawling, faction-filled web of associations and organizations that either collaborated or competed, depending on the situation or the spoils. In 1936, this emerging crime network took what, at first glance, appeared to be a major blow following the arrest and successful prosecution of Luciano by Thomas E. Dewey in a spectacular, if not sensational, trial. Luciano's apparent downfall came via an assault on New York City's prostitution rackets, which his organization firmly controlled. As Alfred McCoy summarizes, Dewey's investigators felt that the forced prostitution charge would be more likely to offend public sensibilities and secure a conviction. A handful of prostitutes who worked in Luciano's brothels testified against him, and a New York court quickly sentenced the gangster to a 30 to 50-year jail term. Dewey's role in this affair is quite interesting. 6 years later, when he ran to secure the presidential nomination for the Republican Party, he joined forces with John Foster Dulles, the brother of Allen Dulles, best known for his role as the first civilian head of the CIA in the early years of the Cold War. Dulles, a member of the internationalist camp of American politics that typified the attitudes of the elite Eastern establishment, impressed upon Dewey the importance of overcoming the isolationist factions of the Republican Party. What Dulles got in exchange for his steering of Dewey in pursuit of political power was his own rise through the ranks of the party, ultimately culminating in his service as President Dwight D. Eisenhower's Secretary of State. Even more curious was an investment that Dewey made during the 1950s in an entity called the Mary Carter Paint Company, later renamed Resorts International. Mary Carter was controlled by the Crosby family, and its operations were overseen by the most practical-minded of the family's sons, James Crosby. Mary Carter was deeply tied to organized crime networks. It worked closely in developing businesses in the Bahamas, hand in hand, with a number of Meyer Lansky frontmen, while James's brother, Peter Crosby, was a notorious confidence man with an impressive roster of criminal contacts. It had also been widely rumored that Mary Carter was a CIA front company. The OSS. Lurking in the background of Operation Underworld, which had seen the ONI directly recruit Luciano, was the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the wartime frontrunner to the CIA and America's first robust national intelligence organization. The precise role that the OSS played in the affair isn't exactly clear. According to George White, a notorious agent of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, who had been recruited into the OSS, he had been propositioned by an organized crime associate to enlist Luciano in exchange for a pardon. But this was a bridge too far. An alliance between the OSS and a person of Luciano's reputation would be a very naive way of doing business. White maintained that he felt it was outrageous to entertain the proposition, even for the OSS, who were willing to do almost anything. White would make these statements in the course of federal testimony, and, in all likelihood, he was lying to protect the OSS. According to Richard Harris Smith, a historian of the OSS, Earl Brennan, an OSS officer in Italy, was kept in the loop regarding negotiations between Luciano and the ONI. Meanwhile, Assistant District Attorney Murray Gurfein, who handled the legal end of Luciano's negotiations, subsequently went to Europe to serve as a colonel in the OSS. The OSS was many things, operating in many different theaters. In Europe, it ran a fairly unsuccessful paramilitary campaign. However, in the China-Burma-India theater, its military operations achieved remarkable results. When it came to spycraft, its supporters gushed with praise, while its detractors regarded the tales later woven by its veterans as worthy of skepticism. The OSS was frequently, and accurately, seen as a social club. While its ranks did boast a great many military officers and figures from other government agencies like the FBI and the FBN, its leadership and higher-ranking administrative posts tended to be secured by the sons of the country's wealthiest elite. In London, Madrid, Geneva, Paris, and elsewhere, posts were held by members of the Mellon family of Pittsburgh, the family behind the Gulf oil fortune. Heirs of the Morgan family also secured positions within the agency, as did members of the DuPont and the Vanderbilt families. Only the Rockefellers were conspicuously absent from the OSS, writes Richard Harris Smith, adding that Nelson Rockefeller headed his own agency, the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs. David Rockefeller, Nelson's brother, also reportedly ran his own intelligence apparatus during the war. The agency itself was something of brainchild, at least partially, of General William J. Donovan, a prominent New York City antitrust lawyer and a veteran of World War I. Along with figures like Dewey and Dulles, Donovan was the consummate Eastern establishment insider. He maintained a deep preoccupation with organization and rationalization, which filtered into his work defending the trusts and combines that dotted the corporate landscape of his day. He was also a firm internationalist when it came to his political outlook. During the interwar years, Donovan had acted as an agent for various corporate interests, and had even traveled to Russia on behalf of the Morgans to collect information on the developments of the Bolshevik Revolution. In the course of his wartime intelligence work, Donovan was first appointed by President Roosevelt to head the Office of the Coordinator of Information, COI, which was intended to help coordinate the scattered intelligence outfits and military organizations that communicated infrequently and cooperated even less. COI was the seed from which the OSS would later spring. Under Donovan's direction, it became a clearinghouse for military and political propaganda. This was in no small part thanks to Donovan's close friend, a British intelligence operative named William Stevenson. Stevenson was the wartime head of a British intelligence unit in the United States, headquartered in New York City and known as the British Security Coordination, BSC. He reported to Stuart Menzies, who was then serving as the head of MI6. Menzies had tasked Stevenson with establishing relations on the highest possible level between the British SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service, another name for MI6, and the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Stevenson and the BSC operated from an office located in Rockefeller Center's International Building, which was also the home of numerous other BSC front organizations. Stevenson also worked closely with other British intelligence agencies, including MI6 itself and the Special Operations Executive, SOE, which had begun its life as Section D of MI6. In agreement with Menzies' mandate, Stevenson developed a close working relationship with J. Edgar Hoover, who seemed to be enthusiastic about being a liaison to British intelligence on matters concerning the war in Europe. At this stage, the U.S. had yet to enter the conflict. Reportedly, the BSC provided the FBI with over 100,000 confidential reports, while Hoover kept the British in the loop, with American reports on German naval movements and the like. The relationship between Hoover and Stevenson would ultimately break down by 1941. Soon after, Stevenson began to cultivate William Donovan, who increasingly challenged Hoover's position as the sole conduit between the Americans and the British. When Donovan was appointed by Roosevelt as the coordinator of information and subsequently formed the OSS, an intense bureaucratic struggle erupted between Hoover and his rivals. As will be discussed in greater detail in the next chapter, this struggle allegedly led Donovan to coordinate with organized crime kingpins, namely Meyer Lansky, to blackmail Hoover in an effort to bring him to heel. Stevenson did more than simply cultivate Donovan. In 1940, he reported back to his handlers in England that there is no doubt we can achieve infinitely more through Donovan than through any other individual. He is very receptive and can be trusted to represent our needs in the right quarters and in the right way in the USA. Donovan's COI and OSS were, in all actuality, the offspring of these British-led efforts, and a great deal of the decisions Donovan made were influenced by figures tied to Stevenson's BSC. Before the COI was up and running, for example, Donovan conferred closely with Robert Sherwood, a playwright, ardent interventionist, and close confidant of President Roosevelt. On June 16, 1941, writes Thomas Mall, Sherwood sent to Donovan a list of people he thought he could trust for the work we discussed yesterday evening at your home. At the time, Sherwood was working closely with the BSC, even sending them copies of speeches he had written for the president prior to Roosevelt receiving them. As efforts were undertaken to get the American intelligence apparatus up and running, the BSC undertook a propaganda campaign aimed at garnering support for such an institution. Mall, in his book Desperate Deception, shows how BSC assets seeded the idea throughout the mass media, which in turn was circulated up to the heights of political power. One characteristic incident took place in May 1941, just a month prior to Donovan's meeting with Sherwood. It was on 9th of that May that Vincent Astor, FDR's friend and New York area coordinator of intelligence, sent the president a clipping from the New York Herald Tribune that was probably a plant to build the consensus for voices calling for the plan British intelligence wanted. The Herald Tribune was BSC's favorite outlet for planted articles. Moreover, the putative author, George Fielding Eliot, was a devoted British sympathizer, one of the most influential people in the BSC front, Fight for Freedom, and a favorite vehicle for planted articles. Citing the threat from fifth columnists and enemy agents, Eliot pointed out with alarm at the lack of a coordinator for the FBI, ONI, and G2 intelligence. The idea of a fifth column was a prime component of BSC propaganda, and would later be adopted by the OSS itself. It was used to attack isolationist holdouts against American entry into the war, and was also used to generate fear and create an atmosphere of distrust among the general public. The term originated during the course of the early phase of the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s, and was used to describe something like a domestic military in waiting. The fifth column was purported to be composed of enemy agents and their sympathizers, with a mandate towards sabotage and other violent activities. According to Mall, one of the strongest promoters of the notion of a Nazi fifth column active in America was a Chicago journalist and close associate of Donovan named Edgar Ansel Maurer, who was subsequently identified as an asset of British intelligence. The fifth column, however, was simply an exaggerated threat. Axis sabotage efforts within the United States did occur, but were limited and ultimately ineffectual. Yet, this reality didn't matter to the BSC and its American allies, as the promotion of fifth column fears had a legitimizing function for their activities. It formed the very justification and popular base of support for the creation and expansion of the emerging organized intelligence apparatus. It also spawned events like Operation Underworld. After all, it was the specter of fifth column activity that had first prompted the collaboration between the ONI and organized crime elements. Even more incredibly, it seems that the legitimization gained by intelligence services through BSC propaganda ultimately benefited these criminal networks as well. At the war's end, naval intelligence began a campaign to have Luciano released from prison, and at the beginning of 1946, the very man who had put Luciano away, Thomas Dewey, commuted the mobster's sentence in exchange for his deportation to Italy. In the year or two that followed, numerous other gangsters, perhaps as many as 100, were deported and joined him. Oh man, gotta take a drink break. All right, let's go back and fix that part. Oh. All right, let's see where we were at. Deported and joined him. Did I just skip a bunch? Oh man, no, I'm good. There we are. Luciano's deportation. Right there. Okay. Luciano's deportation was the beginning of an effort to cement in place a powerful organized crime network that was transnational in scope and wedded to the American intelligence services. Indeed, even though Luciano was no longer physically in the United States, he and his ilk continued to guide organized criminal activities from abroad, while also establishing new rackets during their exile in the Old World. Deported alongside Luciano, for instance, was Frank Coppola, the powerful Detroit mob boss, who had been something of a mentor to Jimmy Hoffa, the mob-linked head of the Teamsters Union. The use of the Teamsters Pension Fund for organized crime-linked financing recurs throughout this book. By the 1960s, Hoffa and the Teamsters were working closely alongside the CIA, particularly on efforts to assassinate Fidel Castro, who had seized many of the mob's casinos during the course of the Cuban Revolution. Coppola himself was linked to American intelligence. He was said to have been behind a 1947 May Day massacre in Sicily, allegedly financed by former OSS chief William Donovan, in which 8 people were killed and 33 wounded. 498 people, mostly left-wingers, were killed in 1948 alone. Also deported was Silvestro Silver Dollar Sam Carolla, a Sicily-born mobster who had arrived in New Orleans, Louisiana in the early 1900s and had become the city's boss. He was particularly close to the interests of New York City organized crime. In the 1930s, Carolla had worked with Costello and Luciano to provide New Orleans with slot machines under the watchful eye of their ally, Huey Long. The gambling operation was so successful that it soon attracted the attention of Lansky, and plans were put in motion to establish centers of communication and money laundering operations to be used by the Underworld on a national scale in New Orleans. This included the opening of 3 big Las Vegas-style gambling casinos across Louisiana, and the introduction of a new rising star in the underworld into this partnership. That rising star was Carlos Marcello. Soon, Marcello was managing the whole of the Louisiana casino operation. When Carolla was deported to Sicily, Marcello was tapped to take his place. And so began the reign of one of the most powerful crime bosses of the 20th century. It was said, wrote John Davis in his book, Mafia Kingfish, Frank Costello sent his blessing from New York, and Sam Carolla sent word from Palermo that he approved Carlos's selection as caretaker boss until he, Silver Dollar Sam, returned from exile. In Italy, Carolla linked up with Luciano in developing what was reported by American law enforcement to be a large-scale drug network. As will be discussed in Chapter 3, this network spanned the Middle East, Europe, and the United States, and one particularly well-oiled pipeline of this network, one that connected Lebanon to Sicily to Marseille, was infamously known as the French Connection. Curiously, Carolla and Luciano turned up in Mexico in 1948 to oversee the development of a drug smuggling operation in that country. While Mexico had its own domestic drug production, it was also a key transshipment point for the flow of heroin, refined from opium produced in the East. Here, we again find the fingerprints of cooperation between intelligence services and organized crime. The Drug Connection and Operation X. The story of the China's Green Gang is complicated, partially due to the mixing of fact with rumor and legend. Yet it is undeniable that their rise was a consequence of the rapid transformations that shook Chinese society in the early 20th century. However, the Green Gang itself began long before the 20th century dawned, originating as a secret society with roots stretching back to Luoism, a folk religion that followed the teachings of Buddhist mystic Luo Minghong. During the late 1700s, this particular branch of Luoism had become a powerful force among boatmen whose trade was the transport of grain and other foodstuffs. Fearful of their growing power, authorities stepped in to suppress this network, driving it underground. Once bitterly ensconced in the margins of society, these Luoists began engaging in smuggling and formed alliances with other smuggling groups. Soon, they consolidated their power and became a formidable force in the world of crime. Under the leadership of Du Yixing, the Green Gang helped bring to power the Kuomintang, KMT, later known as the Nationalist Chinese, under the direction of Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang himself was not a member of the Green Gang, but his political mentor and protector, General Chen Chai-mei, had been. Between the 1920s and 1930s, the Green Gang was fully integrated with the government of Shanghai and became a primary source of power for the KMT. They relied on the Green Gang to conduct counter-espionage activities and gather political intelligence, and called upon the resources of the organization to suppress trade unionists and communists. The Green Gang financed its activities through the cultivation and sale of opium, an activity that was fully sanctioned by Chiang and the KMT. Prior to the KMT's rise to power, Chinese opium production was unorganized, distributed among many different warring figures. Under Chiang, however, a suppression was carried out with the ostensible goal of wiping out the opium trade in the name of public health. Behind the scenes, however, the KMT was doing quite the opposite. The suppression of opium production was actually an integrated effort to centralize it, placing production, distribution, and ultimately control of the substance in the hands of a joint KMT Green Gang monopoly. Support for the KMT opium monopoly came from Western modernizers, including the Rockefeller Foundation, which had set up shop in China during the 1910s with the creation of the China Medical Board. Through this apparatus, the Rockefeller Foundation undertook efforts to promote modern science, develop medical education programs, and set up hospitals. It is likely that the Foundation's support for opium monopolization was intricately bound up with their health crusade, since opium had important, wide-ranging medicinal applications. At the same time, it was also part of a larger tendency among internationalists, like the Rockefellers, to seek the regulation and control of the global drug trade. After the First World War, the nascent League of Nations formed an adversary committee on the traffic of opium and other dangerous drugs. It worked closely with the Rockefeller Foundation's International Health Board, the parent of the China Medical Board. The overarching imperative of the League's efforts for global drug regulation was to rationalize the production of opium and other precursors, and to consolidate drug refining and distribution within a series of select major pharmaceutical corporations. Under Chiang's leadership, China simultaneously kowtowed to the League's initiatives while using the monopolization drive to cement itself as the center of drug production for both the criminal underworld and the legitimate overworld. A full-blown narco-state was in the process of being formed, as opium cultivation came to be the central focus of the government's revenue-raising programs. As Jonathan Marshall noted, in the central provinces of China, especially in Hubei and Hunan, nearly every government organization has come to depend on opium revenue for maintenance, observed one expert. Even law courts, tangpas, Kuomintang organizations, and schools are no exception. Thus, in one locality, authorities charged 1 picul of opium $320 for general taxes, $32 for communist suppression, $3.20 for national revenue, $1.50 for the Chamber of Commerce, $2.50 for special goods, opium, association fees, $2.50 for the His Sun Girls School, and $7 for protection fees. Later, highway maintenance and more school taxes were added. When the opium finally reached Hankou, monopoly authorities added another $920 tax. The original cost of the opium was only $400. It was in this context that American organized crime figures arrived on China's shores and began to organize an intensely lucrative global narcotics trading network. Among the first was Arnold Rothstein, who acted as a mentor to Lansky, Luciano, and Costello. He dispatched a series of frontmen to China: Sidney Steger, Jacob Katzenberg, and George Uffner. Uffner would later be described by federal investigators as a longtime friend of Costello, while Katzenberg was a high-level figure in New York City's Jewish crime syndicates. These syndicates, according to Alfred McCoy, controlled much of New York's heroin distribution. Katzenberg, himself a Lansky flunky as much as a Rothstein frontman, was involved with a secret heroin processing laboratory in the city, which was refining opium flowing from Asia. Hans Dirks, in his encyclopedic History of the Opium Problem, The Assault on the East, 1600 to 1950, suggests that the connections between American organized crime and the KMT Green Gang dominated Chinese opium trade more than likely involved the complicity of Western, predominantly Anglo-American, economic interests in the region. He singles out in particular the powerful Sassoon family. Nicknamed the Rothschilds of the East, the Sassoons had emerged as economic administrators in Iraq before organizing one of the dominant opium trading complexes in the East. It is said, writes Dirks, that 1/5 of all opium brought into China was shipped on the Sassoon fleet. Thanks to opium, they became not only the wealthiest family in India, but also the largest real estate dealers in Shanghai. The family also became integrated into the world of oil. They invested heavily at various times in Britain's Burma Oil and the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a subsidiary of Burma that eventually became British Petroleum, among others. During the 1800s, the Sassoons competed for dominance of the opium trade with Jardine Matheson, one of the great Anglo-Hong Kong trading houses that has been firmly controlled by the prominent Keswick family. Over time, the interests of the Sassoons and the Keswicks intermingled and became part of a vast network winding its way through Hong Kong, Shanghai, and elsewhere. This is by no means ancient history. As late as 2013, the Financial Times reported that Lord James Sassoon, having just finished a stint serving as the commercial secretary to the Treasury in the government of UK Prime Minister David Cameron, became an executive director of the Jardine Matheson board. These dynastic corporate structures not only influenced the shape of the international drug trade during the 20th century, but also the evolution of Western intelligence services during and after World War II. Take, for example, the offspring of Henry Keswick, who served as one of the most powerful heads of Jardine Matheson and the controller of numerous affiliated entities, such as the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, the Hong Kong and Whampoa Company, and the Shanghai Municipal Council. Two of Henry's sons, John Henry Keswick and William Johnston Tony Keswick, served in the Chinese theater as part of the UK's Special Operations Executive. In addition to the SOE, John Henry Keswick served as the personal aide to Lord Mountbatten, the Supreme Allied Commander of the Southern Asia Theater. Tony Keswick, meanwhile, crossed paths with Federal Bureau of Narcotics, FBN veteran, and OSS operative Garland Williams. When the OSS was still being organized and efforts were underway to expand its paramilitary capacities, Williams was dispatched by Preston Goodfellow, a former Hearst executive and publisher of Brooklyn Eagle, who had become William Donovan's special assistant, to meet with the SOE officer. After meeting the British spymaster Keswick, writes Douglas Valentine, Williams returned to Washington with the SOE's training manuals and helped establish OSS training schools in Maryland and Virginia. After the war came to an end, Tony Keswick returned to the world of corporate affairs, taking up a position running one of the family's correspondent companies in London. He also served for a time as a governor of the Hudson's Bay Company in Canada. As discussed in the next chapter, the Hudson's Bay Company was central to the rise of the Bronfman family, who have long straddled the murky line between legitimate corporate enterprises and the criminal underworld. In turn, the Bronfmans, as will be illustrated at length in this book, would be important to the rise of the network that later enabled the illicit activities of Jeffrey Epstein. Through his acquisition of the SOE manuals from Keswick, Garland Williams played an essential role that paralleled and was almost certainly framed by the higher level cooperation between William Donovan and William Stevenson. At the same time, Williams appears to have operated at the intersection of the American intelligence services, still in their infancy, and the networks of American organized crime. In his book, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, Peter Dale Scott theorizes that there existed a formation that he provisionally dubs Operation X, Williams and other veterans of the FBN that were brought into the OSS and the CIA are identified as players in this apparatus. The intelligence mob collaboration established with Operation Underworld did not end after World War II. On the contrary, post-war narcotics operations overseas were subordinated to anti-communist activities, and they were used as a cover for ongoing use of mob assets, above all drug traffickers around the world. In developing these post-war mob contacts, White and his FBN associates, notably his former supervisor Garland Williams and his protege Charles Segusa, even while formally back in the FBN hierarchy, functioned as a counterintelligence unit attached to the CIA and, at times, the Army. In the 1950s and 1960s, it would appear that the FBN systematically subordinated the prosecution of drug cases to a second hidden agenda, the use of traffickers as agents against communism. One example that Scott cites is the selective arrests made by George White in a 1959 heroin case involving the anti-communist and pro-Kuomintang Hip Sing Tong or gang. White, an agent for the FBN and OSS, who was a contractor for the CIA after the war, had busted a heroin ring operating out of San Francisco that tracked back to these pro-KMT gangster elements, and then subsequently identified the heroin as originating from Chinese communists. Interestingly, White himself had a history with the Hip Sing Tongs. In 1936, he infiltrated the notorious Hip Sing Tong Brotherhood of Seattle by masquerading as a drug dealer, leading to a massive sting operation that nabbed some 30 drug smugglers and their associates. It is worth saying a bit more about George White, who was no stranger to courting the services of organized crime figures to bolster the early American intelligence apparatus. The research carried out by the late Hank Albarelli has shown that White cultivated a protege named Pierre Lafitte, who he had recruited into the CIA as a special employee in June 1952. 20 years prior, Lafitte worked in France for Jean Voitzis, the greatest importer of manufactured Chinese opium into Europe, and a figure of considerable interest to the FBN. Later, Lafitte turned up in Cuba in the company of Amleto Battisti y Laura, a Corsican expat who had partnered with Meyer Lansky in a Havana hotel. Battisti, according to a 1955 FBI memo, was, for many years, known unofficially as the Numbers King of Havana. When White brought Lafitte to the CIA, the FBN agent was himself being recruited by Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist who was working at the agency's Office of Technical Service. There, Gottlieb oversaw the CIA's research into potential truth drugs, which in time expanded into a sweeping inquiry that dealt with the effects of drugs, shock therapy, and sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and even more esoteric currents on the human mind. The most famous of these programs, MKUltra, saw the CIA become the largest consumer of LSD, which it used to experiment on witting and unwitting subjects. The subjects included soldiers, patients in psychiatric hospitals, prisoners, sometimes organized crime figures, and private citizens. Under Gottlieb's directions, CIA-run safe houses were established in New York City and San Francisco, where unsuspecting people were dosed with hallucinogenic substances while being monitored from behind two-way mirrors. Gottlieb was impressed by White's street smarts and his inclinations toward the other side of the law, traits that were necessary for the covert drug program. As one of Gottlieb's agency employees later stated, "We were Ivy League, white, middle class. We were naive, totally naive about this. And he felt pretty expert. He knew the whores, the pimps, the people who brought in the drugs. He was a pretty wild man." Under the alias of Morgan Hall, White maintained a safe house in Greenwich Village, New York City, where he supplied unsuspecting people with LSD and other substances. In order to lure people into his web, he deployed false life stories. He posed alternatively as a merchant seaman or a bohemian artist and consorted with a vast array of underworld characters, all of whom were involved in vice, including drugs, prostitution, gambling, and pornography. In 1955, Harry J. Anslinger, the commissioner of the FBN, transferred White to San Francisco to fill a vacant post as the FBN district supervisor for the city. This was by no means the end of his work with Gottlieb and the CIA. Instead, he was granted control of MK Ultra Subproject 42, or, as White called it, Operation Midnight Climax. Midnight Climax involved a safe house, much like the one set up in New York City, which was then decked out with electronic surveillance equipment. Prostitutes were then enlisted, who would lure unsuspecting clients back to the pad, where they would then be slipped LSD. John Gittinger, a Harvard psychologist who was on the CIA payroll, best known perhaps for developing the personality assessment system, later admitted in congressional testimony that the agency was interested in the combination of certain drugs with sex acts. We looked at the various pleasure positions used by prostitutes and others. Some of the women, the professionals we used, were very adept at this practice. White wasn't alone in obscuring the role of the KMT in the drug trade. This was also the modus operandi of Harry Anslinger, the FBN commissioner, who served as boss to both George White and Garland Williams. Although Anslinger, like Donovan, was a bitter enemy of J. Edgar Hoover, he rode the rising tide of McCarthyism in the U.S. and identified China as the number one threat to public order. The Chinese Communist Party, he claimed in the media and in official FBN reports, was overseeing vast opium fields and had trained thousands of agents to distribute heroin within the West. Per Anslinger, Chinese opium production totaled more than 4,000 tons a year, with the profits from the smuggling being used to finance the activities of the Communist Party and the obtained strategic raw materials. Importantly, Anslinger did not have any agents located in Asia in the post-war years, with FBN posting taking place at a fairly late date in 1962. The claims made by Anslinger in the 1950s were sourced from intelligence provided by the KMT itself, and, in the early years, by the intelligence apparatus of General Douglas MacArthur's military command in post-war Japan. Overseeing this intelligence web was MacArthur's protege, a fascist sympathizer named General Charles Willoughby. Willoughby, as will be discussed in Chapter 5, would later become a player in the so-called China Lobby, a domestic political pressure network that supported the KMT and hardline Cold War politics. It is doubtful that the misdirection being deployed by Anslinger, White, and others in their milieu was for propagandistic purposes alone. Scott's Operation X thesis suggests a dual function. First, it bolstered Cold War propaganda efforts, which roughly followed the same template as the fifth column propaganda of the OSS during World War II. Second, it helped hide the roles of certain individuals, organizations, and networks that worked in tandem with Western intelligence services, militaries, governments, and businesses in the global drug trade. During this period, investigations into organized crime in America were soft-pedaled, if they took place at all, in part thanks to coercion and blackmail, particularly the blackmailing of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. This also worked to obscure the role of the KMT in the drug trade, due to the historical unity of American organized crime with Asian drug traffickers, forged in the interwar period. There is the stark possibility that this unity was maintained well into the post-war epoch, through the efforts of American intelligence services themselves. This would result from the long-term effects of the OSS apparatus that had been set up in the China-India-Burma theater during the war. That apparatus had been concentrated around a powerful unit called Detachment 101, which, incidentally, had been set up with the aid of Garland Williams. Many of the most notorious intelligence operatives and soldiers who dotted the landscape of the late 20th century can trace their roots back to this OSS theater, and many of them will appear throughout this book. Those who served there included E. Howard Hunt, later a CIA coup master, who achieved infamy during Watergate. Another was John Singlaub, a major player in the Iran-Contra affair. There was also Paul Helliwell, soon to become one of the architects of convoluted shadow banking strategies and a primary node between the worlds of intelligence and organized crime. In 1943, William R. Pierce, who would later lead the CIA's first training program, became the head of OSS Detachment 101 after his predecessor, Carl F. Eifler, was injured. Pierce subsequently became the head of all OSS operations in the China-Burma-India theater, and personally oversaw commando operations carried out by KMT troops against Chinese Communist forces. Pierce later reflected on his OSS years in an autobiography and, while discussing payment issues needed to finance the OSS's operations in Asia, made a startling disclosure. Simply stated, paper currency and even silver were often useless, as there was nothing to buy with money. Opium, however, was the form of payment everybody used. Not to use it as a means of barter would spell an end to our operations. Opium was available to agents who used it for a number of reasons, from obtaining information to buying their own escape. Any indignation felt was removed by the difficulty of the effort ahead. If opium could be useful in achieving victory, the pattern was clear. We would use opium. The OSS activities in Burma would lay the groundwork for the country to subsequently act as an essential node in early Cold War activities against communist elements in Asia. Importantly, after Chinese communists drove the KMT out of the mainland and into Taiwan, Burma became one of their main outposts. There, the CIA organized a secret army with prospective plans to stage an invasion of China. Although the KMT was to fail in its military operations, writes Alfred McCoy, it succeeded in monopolizing and expanding the opium trade. He continues, the KMT shipped the opium harvests to northern Thailand, where they were sold to General Phao Sianan of the Thai police, a CIA client. The CIA had promoted the Phao-KMT partnership to secure a rear area for the KMT, but this alliance soon became a critical factor in the growth of Southeast Asia's narcotics traffic. With CIA support, the KMT remained in Burma until 1961, when a Burmese army offensive drove them into Laos and Thailand. By this time, however, the Kuomintang had already used their control over the tribal populations to expand Shan state opium production by almost 500%, from less than 80 tons after World War II to an estimated 300 to 400 tons by 1962. The CIA's Burma-Thailand support for the KMT was codenamed Operation Paper. One of the architects of the operation was a close associate of Thailand's General Phao named Willis Bird, later nicknamed Mr. Opium. Bird, during World War II, had served with OSS in the Burma-China-India theater. After the end of the conflict, he remained in the region as a supplier to the Thai military and police. Whether or not Bird was an on-the-books asset of the CIA isn't clear, though he certainly was a middleman for moving supplies that had been obtained via agency financing. These supplies arrived in Thailand by way of a company called Southeast Asia Supply Corporation, most frequently referred to simply as SEA Supply. Willis Bird acted as SEA Supply's Bangkok office manager under the direction of Sherman Jost, a veteran of OSS Detachment 101. SEA Supply was not set up in Thailand, however. The business was instead registered in Miami, Florida, by OSS veteran turned lawyer and banker Paul Hillowell. At the same time that Hillowell was handling the legal end of SEA's supplies activities, he was also acting as consul for the Thai government in the U.S. In this capacity, he was closely linked to General Phao and the network of politicians who supported him. SEA Supply worked closely with Civil Air Transport, CAT, the CIA's first proprietary airline. The roots of CAT were planted during the Second World War, when Claire Chennault organized the Flying Tigers, a volunteer aviation unit set up to provide support for the KMT in China in their fight against Japan. With ranks drawn from the U.S. military, the Flying Tigers trained at bases in Burma, which acted as a logistics hub for their airlift. Chennault had long-standing ties to the KMT. Since the late 1930s, Chennault had served as a military advisor to Chiang Kai-shek and his brother-in-law, the powerful nationalist Chinese banker and diplomat T.V. Soong. Besides his links to the KMT leadership and to the U.S. military, Chennault maintained an impressive array of contacts. His lawyer was Thomas Corcoran, a top advisor in President Roosevelt's New Deal Brain Trust. Corcoran was close to Hillowell, and both worked together to promote Chennault's aviation plans when the war ended. Back in America, Chennault fell in with the so-called China lobby, the network of politicians, businessmen, and other players who lobbied for support for the KMT as the only viable group who could oppose the Chinese communists. He set up and managed an impressive airlift of American relief supplies in China, with the supply flight contracts going to Chennault, of course. Central to this effort was the 1946 creation of a new airline called Civil Air Transport that Chennault had co-founded with Whiting Willier. Willier would go on to be U.S. ambassador to Costa Rica and was also later involved in the 1954 CIA-led coup in Guatemala. When the KMT retreated to the island of Formosa, now Taiwan, Chennault used CAT to run arms and medical supplies to national Chinese fighters. CAT was brought into the world of special operations thanks to the efforts of Hillowell. He had brought Chennault and the aviation company to the attention of Frank Wisner, then the head of a covert body called the Office of Policy Coordination, OPC. Within several years, the OPC was incorporated into the CIA, cementing in place a militarized command structure governing the dark arts of the clandestine services. By 1950, CAT was a full-fledged CIA proprietary airline, operating under the auspices of a holding company set up by the agency called Airedale Corps. Later, Airedale Corps was renamed Pacific Corp, and CAT would become Air America. Let's go back a little bit. Okay. Cat would become Air America. Almost to a chapter break. That'll work right there. Air America. Air America was the CIA's premier airline and remained active from the 1950s into the 1970s. It was finally dissolved in the wind down of the Vietnam War, though many of its assets were sold off and absorbed into a CIA-linked firm called Evergreen International Aviation. Meanwhile, several Flying Tigers pilots went on to create the air freighter firm Flying Tiger Line, a major commercial cargo airline that also operated military contract services and engaged in covert operations. Flying Tiger Line would later have a major presence at the Rickenbacker Airfield near Lockbourne, Ohio. CAT's later incarnation, Southern Air Transport, would relocate there in the early 1990s, a few years after Flying Tiger Line was absorbed into Federal Express. The airline's relocation was thanks, in part, to Jeffrey Epstein, and had chiefly relocated to manage cargo for Leslie Wexner's The Limited. See Chapter 17. Connections to organized crime appear in nearly every corner of this web. Take, for instance, Margaret Chung, an attending physician for Chenault's Flying Tigers. A member of the hip Sing Tong, she made frequent trips to Mexico City in the 1940s in the company of Virginia Hill, an inside player in organized crime circles with close ties to the likes of Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky. During this period, Hill became intimate with a number of Mexico's top politicians, army officers, diplomats, and police officials, which likely facilitated the activities of her friends in the underworld. Hill was also particularly close to the Chicago outfit during this time, the significance of which will become clear shortly. As mentioned above, Mexico had become an important base of operations for the drug smuggling network of Costello and Carolla. Given their ties to Meyer Lansky, it is certainly possible that Hill's own appearance in Mexico was connected to these earlier activities. Importantly, Mexico had also become a vital transshipment point for the KMT's own drug trafficking during this same period. Does the presence of Margaret Chung alongside Hill, then, suggest that the KMT's drug operations in Mexico directly intersected with those of Lansky and his milieu? Given the history of Lansky associates working with the KMT and the Green Gang, it is certainly possible, if not likely. The structure of this apparently intricate network can be developed further when considering that civil air transport, one of the successors to the Flying Tigers, was, by 1960, flying in and out of Laotian territory controlled by the Hmong tribesmen. The tribesmen were a major supplier of opium destined for refinement into heroin. The CIA's covert support for the Hmong is discussed in Chapter 5. Airstrips for CAT's flights were built by Bird and Sons, a private engineering firm controlled by the CAT representative in Bangkok, William H. Bird. Bird was the cousin of Willis Bird of the OSS and of Hellawell's SEA Supply. There was also the case of Hellawell himself. By this point, he had become a prominent player in Republican politics. He was, for example, a delegate for Dwight Eisenhower as he strove to clinch the Republican Party's presidential nomination. Hallowell had also been a leader in the Florida chapter of Citizens for Eisenhower. That chapter was subsequently accused of being taken over by professionals who refused to work with the regular GOP leaders and who are accountable to no one for the finances they collect. Members of this cadre of operators, aside from Hallowell, included Kurt Landon and James Gilmartin. Together, these three men were tightly connected co-conspirators, amassing unaccountable power. Landon is a substantial client of Hallowell's law firm. Gilmartin is a partner of Hallowell's, and Gilmartin is married to Landon's daughter. We find these men closely allied by business and marriage who, if their plan succeeds, will find themselves in a position of enormous power in Florida and responsible to no recognized Republican authority. While Hallowell was making waves in the world of politics and in the world of covert operations, he was also making a foray into the world of Florida insurance. He was the consul for, and later secretary, then chairman, of American Bankers Life Insurance, located in Miami. Importantly, Hallowell utilized the offices of American Bankers Life as the hub for many of his activities. The Florida Thai consulate, for instance, was located at the same address as the insurance company, as was SEA Supply. In addition to this important CIA linkage, American Bankers Life also shared important connections, one of which was Hallowell himself, with Miami National Bank. Founded with a loan from the Teamsters Pension Fund, Miami National was identified in 1969 as having served between 1963 and 1967 as a conduit through which hot syndicate money was exported by Meyer Lansky's couriers and laundered through the Interlocking Exchange and Investment Bank in Geneva. The importance of Lansky's Geneva Bank will be discussed in Chapter 3. Hallowell's ventures, and specifically his banking endeavors, were probably related to the flow of heroin that originated as KMT Opium and then passed through the hands of American organized crime figures. In his book, Hot Money and the Politics of Debt, offshore banking expert R.T. Naylor writes that South Florida is a major refuge for Latin American flight money, which pours into the Florida banking system and local real estate. The flight capital into real estate business is an old one. In the 1950s and 1960s, Kuomintang money from Thailand and Burma came via Hong Kong to be washed in Lansky-related property firms. All right, I am stopping there today, and we're going to start next time at the Supermob. We have read 33 pages out of 1,137. My goodness. Only 100 more episodes to go. But if you want to go through it with me, please subscribe and we will go through this together. I'm going to switch to me for a second. Why am I reading this book? Well, I'm a father of two sweet little girls, 5 and 7, and I can't live with myself to be in a nation where all the fathers of this nation don't get together and find justice for the victims of Jeffrey Epstein. I can't live in a world where we don't try to do that, and I wanted to strike while the iron is hot. I feel this is a moment that is bringing together the left and the right. As I told my friend earlier today, I said, I think this is a huge moment. This focus on Epstein and the demanding of Trump and the Republican senators and people in our government to do what we sent you in there to do and spill the beans on these mothers. Okay? That's what we sent you there to do. There's nothing to see. Dude, look at this book. It goes on for 1,000 pages. There's a lot to see here. There's a lot of threads to pull on, and we think we know why you don't want to pull on it, because it will expose the intelligence agencies. But that's what we put you into there to do, is to destroy the deep state. So I told my friend, I said, this is a huge moment. It unifies the left and right against the intelligence agencies of the ruling class. And as a communist, I find it's a important time. It's a great way to spread MAGA communism. I got my blue collar on right here. I'm straight out of work. I worked all day today. I came home to read this book to try to spread the message. Whitney, I know it's your book. That's why I put in the description. Go support Whitney at Unlimited Hangout. She's going to have a much more professional version of this audiobook. Go there and listen to it. If you guys are listening to this now, as I record each part, I'll always start right at the book. So if you get to the part where I talk and you don't want to listen to me talk, just hit next on the playlist. I'm going to make a playlist, and you can just keep going through the book like that. Okay. One other thing I wanted to mention in here, I'll come back to the footnotes, but I listened to, I can't remember the guy that was on Tucker. I can't remember his name. He was on Tucker talking about Epstein. He does the Martyr Made podcast. And I really like that guy. Hang on. I'm going to look and see what his name is. I want to call him Daryl, but I don't think that's his name. I'm about halfway through it. But courage is contagious. I heard what he had to say, and it's like, you know what? Screw it. I'm going to start recording that book. And if it takes me 100 episodes to do this, that's great, because we need to keep it in the zeitgeist. Sometimes I'm like, what do I have to add as a YouTuber? We just need, you should start a channel. Do exactly what I'm doing. Find a book that's important to you, and Aaron Good's book needs to be on here. There's a lot of books that need to be on here. What is it at Rogue State? What's that book? Killing Hope by William Bloom. That needs to be on here. They just go forever. There's more than one person can do, but if we all do it together, we can really wake people up and educate the masses. Because the only way we're going to get these files for real is a revolution. I said this in my last stream. When Lenin did the Bolshevik Revolution, he published the Sykes-Picot Agreement that showed that the British and the French, and obviously they'd been working with the Russian Tsar and the elite there too, had planned how to divide up the Middle East to get them all to fight against each other and take their oil. They also did that, I can't remember the exact name, the Berlin Conference, where they divided up Africa. And he just published it. He showed, here you go. Here's all the things they were planning to do. And they were sending you to war to die to do what they wanted to do. That's the only way you're going to get these files. You're going to have a working class revolution, not elect, a billionaire that wants to be liked by the working class. I mean, it's better than the alternative, I guess, but it's not going to get us these files because he's in them probably. At least enough to be like, nothing to see here. Are you crazy? Quit looking. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. Daryl, what was his name? I just was listening to it. ADD, squirrel. Where is it at? Sagar did really good on there with, what's his name? Sagar was on with that normie comedian guy. Sagar and Jetty was on Flagrant with, what is that guy's name? What is his name? I bet it's not going to tell me. Sagar. Everyone knows his name probably, but I don't know his name. I never listened to him. I know he was on Tim Dillon. Anyway, Sagar did go on there. The full evidence, Epstein was a spy with Sagar and Jetty on Flagrant. It's got 1 million views. This one, Tucker Carlson and Daryl Cooper on the true history of Jeffrey Epstein. So that one's also got 1 million views. It appears if you're big, they will push Epstein material. For me, I've had 2 people watching this. So if you are new, the algorithm is not going to be helpful to you. We did have a few people come by. But anyway, yeah, Daryl Cooper, he said, I don't care if a thermonuclear bomb goes off and explodes the human race and the planet melts. I want to know who did this to these kids, because kids are sacred. These people have weirdo paintings in their house. You know, it's satanic stuff. And I want to know who they are. And I want them to be exposed. And I want them to be prosecuted. And I'm not afraid to die, or, you know, I don't care what happens. Like, you cannot let stuff like this go on. And I don't understand how someone just doesn't get in there. I guess they don't let people like Thomas Massey know. But Kurt Metzger said it on Jimmy one day. You know, like, as a parent, you don't want anyone to threaten your kids, but we need people like Mouse and his own son. That's fun too in here, where they, you know, you grew up in America where they demonized Mao, and then you see in here they were flooding China with opium. Like, Mao, the first thing Mao did was like kill anybody that was selling opium, which, I mean, I don't know how else you would clean up that. What are you going to do? Turn it into Portland, Oregon? No, you got to get rid of it. It was, the whole society was making money off of it. He got rid of it. He got rid of the landowners and ran out the bourgeoisie. Somebody had to. It sucks. I mean, it's not nice, but if you care about your people as a father, you have to stop people like this from doing this, because they will do it. These psychopaths will do it. Somebody has to stand up, like Mouse and his own son. I think he died in North Korea. I don't want anything to ever happen to my kids. I love my kids. I want to protect my kids. But, like, you can't be threatened by these people. You can't threaten me, you know. Somebody needs to stand up and be like, do whatever you want. Do whoever you want. But I'm still going to go after you till the day I die. You know, the British did that to the Irish. They tried every which way they could. And the Irish said, it's better to die on my feet than live on my belly. I'm not going to live on my belly to these people. Okay, you're not going to threaten me. You're not going to scare me out of standing up and telling the truth about you. And I don't understand. Why don't you just do that, Trump? You'd be like the biggest legend ever. Do they really have you that compromise that much? Are you trying to do something with the financial system so you think it's okay until you get to August and you revalue gold? And what is going on? I don't understand. But this is bourgeois politics. It's not working class politics. What we want as the working class is someone to stand up like a communist would, like Stalin would, like Mao would, and just tell us honestly what's going on. Who's the enemy? What's going on? How to fix it? Dare I say? What did they do in China? That was real democracy. They let the landlords, they put the landlords out, and they said, okay, we're going to have democracy. What do you guys want to do with these people? Let's vote. What do you think they voted to do with them? Let's line up all the drug dealers that have been pushing opium here. Like the people that they talked about in here. Let's line them up. Oh, this guy's a CIA agent. What should we do with him, guys? Let's vote. They're coming across the world to screw up your life. Let's vote on what to do with them. You know what the working class would do. And the working class would do it here. You want to vote on Bill Gates? You want to vote on Jeffrey Epstein? Let's have a vote on what we should do with Ghislaine Maxwell. Okay? Y'all are flirting. And, you know, what am I? I'm a school teacher. I'm just going to work at Walmart and read my little books on the internet. Do what I can. Try to spread it. We need to form a party, a working class party, if these people could get along and not fight over the egos on the left in America are. I've seen it up close. It's just the smallest. It's down to like people calling each other slurs, and like, I mean, obviously, either our society is so individualistic, or the mechanisms of the live streaming, you know, YouTube sphere are so toxic, or I think this is really it. We're not really in a revolutionary moment, so people aren't coming together. But we need to come together, form a party of the working class, form a dictatorship of the proletariat, and take care of these Jeffrey Epstein people. That's the only way you're going to get the files. It's the only way. And it doesn't have to be violent, but probably the other side will make it violent. Because you'll try to pass a law, or you'll try to bring them to justice, and then you'll start seeing extrajudicial killings of the people trying to do justice. This is one of the biggest light bulb moments of what happened to like communists in China. They're like, no, we're having a revolution. We're not going to have opium anymore. You know, the landlords don't get to just treat us as serf slaves, and then they start fighting back. That's where fascism comes from. It's capitalism and revolt. It's imperialism, you know, stuff like in this book. It's that in revolt. And if the working class doesn't stand up and stop it courageously, they will go all the way. And it's satanic. It's a psychopathic, satanic elite. Alex has been right for 30 years. Mr. Jones, I salute you. If we don't stand up, and they do it in the shadows. And I think their best tactic is to be like, oh, you're a crazy person for thinking, oh yeah, I'm sure somebody's in charge of all that. No, they just shut down every school in the world on a whim. It was just decided it, you know. Last thing I wanted to say about this, as a teacher, I think these books are so cool. Like Aaron Good, Whitney Webb. This could make kids really interested in research. Like I try to show the kids that you can click on these footnotes and look at this. Look at this Chicago style. You got Peter Dale Scott, Stephen Kinzer. I mean, this is real research. You got Alfred McCoy. This is what research is actually for. As a working class tool, it can bring down the powerful. It's not just a lame thing you write about horses to get a grade. It can be used to change the world. All right. So I think I said everything I wanted to say. Let's go through the comments here. Hydriag, love you, buddy. Love you, buddy. My buddy Jason. Thank you for stopping by and being nice. Sean Moon, pronounced Luch I-N-O, not loose I-N-O. Dude, I will mess up so many of these. But thank you for helping me. I apologize beforehand. I'll never get through it if I try to look up how everything's pronounced. But thank you. Lucky Luciano, yes. Wild Bill Donovan, yes. Not Luciano, pronounced Luciano. I'll try to fix it, man. It's just say Luciano. Just say Luciano. 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 I'll go around the house. I'll sing it with my girls. Luciano. Luciano. See if I get it. Okay, you want to pronounce it. I give Luciano. I give up. I'm just going to frustrate you, buddy. I just can't resist. Subsequently is not pronounced subsequently. Subsequently is pronounced subsequently. Sean, you were such a nice person. You're right. I have a degree in English. Can you believe that? But when you read thousands of words out loud, you don't always get every single one of them right. I actually thought I did pretty good considering how much I had to read, but no, you're good. I get it. I would probably do the same thing. I get it. Thank you for reading such an important book. Thank you, Tyler McConnell. Buddy, you're okay. This is you saying thank you and saying it's an important book. And thank you for your comments. I wish I could get every single one right. I try hard, but anyway, I know Sean, if that's who I think I know you. I think I met you. I know you're a dad too, and this is so important. You know, the dads of America need to get together and lock in and not give up on this. You know, you got to be like a dog with a bone. These people cannot get away with this. We can't let them. We can't let them. We gotta. The working people of this country, the people that hold it up, the normal people, the people that you ask what should be done with Jeffrey Epstein, and they give you the right answer. They don't go, oh, it's crazy. Why are you talking about that? Oh, why are you talking about something crazy like that? You know, what did Trump say about Ghislaine? We wish her well. You wish her well. You wish that lady well. The lady hanging out outside of junior high schools, snatching people's daughters for her own machinations for the CIA and MI6 and Mossad and Epstein and his billionaire buddies. You wish her well. Okay. I don't wish her well. And I don't think God wishes her well. Satan might wish her well. I still hope she squeals like a piggy and tells us everyone. Walk free for a while on that one. Let's get to the top of it, you know. But I fear that thank you, Sean. I fear that Alex Craner may be correct, you know. Prince Andrew, he's walking free today. And what about the girl that he messed up? What was her name? Virginia DeFrey. She almost got ran over by a bus and then took her own life, tragically. Took her own life, I'm sure, maybe. Yeah. There's a whole lot of people taking their own life in these stories, ain't they? The 2 bullets to the head, suicide attempt. A lot of people unbelievably doing the old one of these in the prison stall. How you doing that? Oh, the camera's messed up. Okay, sure. So can't let them get away with it, guys. We got to man up and do what we can to fix this country. It's not, you can't, I don't think, some Christians just think like, oh, we just write off the world. This is Satan's world. I don't think that's how we're supposed to behave. That makes no sense to me from God. Why did God make men to do nothing? To just be like, just go in the cave and repeat, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me 1,000,000 times, 1,000,000,000 times, and then you can come to heaven. I think we're supposed to stand up and do something against evil like this. At least I'm going to. And if God doesn't agree with me, well, send me where you need to send me, Lord. But I think I'm acting from the heart of a father, and I think God has that same heart of a father. Yes, rest in peace, Gary Webb. Absolutely, Sean. A real one that got this started, Dark Alliance series. That book there needs to be an audiobook of that on here. Goes on and on and on. But anyway, thank you guys for dropping by. There's various ways to support me in the description, but literally everyone on the internet says that now, and you're probably just as broke as me, so don't worry about that. But I do have a couple loyal Patreon people, and I love them for that. So God bless y'all. God bless you, Sean. Thanks for stopping by, man. Hydra Yeg, thank you for stopping by. And anybody watching this, if you want to see part 2, we'll just read through this together. Probably take us a couple years as a working class dad. That's okay. It'll keep people interested. It's little breadcrumbs constantly going out there. We need a wiki for this. I guess we have, what is it? Wiki Spooks or Deep State. I think it's Wiki Spooks. Anyway, that's a good one. Thanks, Sean. God bless you, brother. Let's pray for the protection of children all across the country, and God work through men and through politics. Give the working class courage and a path to bringing these people to justice so we don't have to live in a world like this anymore. Okay, let's bring a little bit of heaven to earth. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace out, and God bless.